physicist with broad interest in the field of buildings, energy sustainability, and the interplay between energy end-use demand systems and the whole energy system. So just to get you excited about about this talk, so serving on editorial boards is one part of his academic contribution, but he's the co-author or author of approaching 100 journal papers. Maybe it's gone beyond that now. He can enlighten us as I pass the mic or the Zoom over. 3 books, numerous reports, and conference papers across all of these very important topics for the conference theme. He makes a lot of contributions at his own university, but also to his country and to the field at a global level. So in 2009, he co-founded the Energy
Institute. As its starting point, the idea that energy system modeling is a valuable tool to support the development of policy to decarbonize the energy system.
Oh, I think that there's... there is a talk that started there. So he's co-founded the UCL Energy Institute, which he's also directed, and he's also been highly engaged with leading and participating in a number of projects and programs funded by the UK's Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. All their research councils have slightly different names. So a few examples: he's presently the director of the London Loughborough Centre for Doctoral Training on Energy Demand, and its successor, the Center for Doctoral Training. Wow, this is so impressive, for doctoral training in energy resilience and the built environment. In addition, he's leading the decarbonization of heat challenge within the Center for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. My word, we're in for a real treat here. The title of his talk is Lost Generation, System Resilience and Flexibility. I'll pass over now to Professor Lowe. I'll only jump in if we're starting to really cut into question time, because I'm sure you'll have a lot of good questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I'm afraid it can only be downhill after that introduction. So let's see first of all if I can share this screen. Here we go. So, can you see anything? Thank you, Chair, for your introduction.
Not yet.
Right, okay. I have a bit of a problem, which is there appears to be an audio channel embedded in my keynote presentation. And I'm not quite sure what I can do with that, except perhaps to let it run. Let's have one more go at this.
We could also run the video if that's easier for you, and then you could take live questions.
Yes, and then if I may, I'll cut in the last couple of slides and just do the alternative ending.
Okay, wonderful. Jude, do you have that on hand, or shall I do that from here?
Could you run the video from your end?
I can actually.
Yes,
Hang on. I got it. I'm about to get it up and running right now.
So yeah, so Sarah, if you could do it, that's fine too.
I got it. I somehow got it together.
Well, thank you, Chair, for your introduction.
Of course, of course.
Robert Lowe, Director of the CRED's Decarbonisation of Heat Challenge, and I'm delighted to be taking part in the 2020 MIT Applied Energy Symposium. I wish to acknowledge my funder, the UK EPSRC, which is part of UK Research and Innovation, and my co-authors, particularly Lifelong Chu, Steve Pye, and our collaborators in the centre, in the rest of the Centre for Research and into Energy Demand Solutions. So, our paper takes as its starting point the idea that while energy system modelling is a valuable tool to support the development of policy to decarbonise the energy system, quantitative insights produced by such models necessarily omit potentially important features of physical and engineering reality. We argue that important socio-technical insights can be gained by studying critical events, such as the loss of 2.1 gigawatts of generation from the electricity system of Great Britain in August 2019. One of the features of this incident was multiple interlocking failures of critical systems outside the energy system itself and in energy demand systems outside the supply system. Our paper uses this event as a starting point for a discussion of the need for additional tools drawn from the system architecture literature to support the design and realization of future fully decarbonized systems with high penetrations of renewable energy. In this keynote presentation, we extend and deepen this discussion. But before I go very much further, I need to define energy system architecture. So the definition that got our present project funded is the spatial, topological, and functional organization of the energy system and its key subsystems, namely generation, conversion, transmission, distribution, storage, and end-use systems. As defined here, architecture is an emergent property of the whole system. All of this, of course, begs the question what it is specifically about energy systems that makes this perspective so valuable. Why do we need energy system architecture in the first place? A partial answer to this is that energy system architecture, interacting with synergies and economies of scales, turns out to be a powerful model, a modifier of technology costs, a determinant of technology shares, and a constrainer and enabler of future directions of change. I want to begin to illustrate this with two examples around storage. The question I'm posing here is, where should we put the energy storage in the context of the objective of decoupling supply and demand for space heating in the buildings, in the UK building stock over periods of several months. It turns out that the storage needed to do this is equivalent to something like 25 cubic meters of water per dwelling. And the question is, at what scale to deploy this storage and what will the cost be? The 3 points on this graph correspond roughly to water stores of 100 litres, 300 cubic metres, and just under 100,000 cubic metres. The data point for 100 litres on the left-hand side includes a rough estimate of the cost of space within a dwelling. Stores of this size are almost all of these housed inside the dwelling. And the objective, as I say, is to provide 25 cubic meters of dwelling one way or the other. If we do this with technology at the scale of individual 25 cubic meter stores, one per dwelling, the total cost, it turns out, will be the order of £1 trillion. And this is infeasible in the context of a total budget, a total estimated cost for decarbonising the United Kingdom energy system of 1 to 2 trillion. It will consume the whole of that budget. But if we were instead to deploy storage in units of 100,000 cubic meters, the picture transforms. The cost reduces by 2 orders of magnitude, down to roughly £10 billion, which will fit comfortably within, which is entirely consistent with a 1 to 2 trillion program for the whole transformation. The problem, of course, is that large, sensible heat storage is only feasible in the presence of heat networks, and at present, only about 3% of UK buildings are connected to heat networks. This neatly illustrates the tension, the interaction between energy system architecture and the enablement and constraining of individual technologies. And this brings me on to my second example, which is how to provide 100 terawatts of storage, roughly 100 terawatts of energy storage, which will be needed to back up the whole of the energy system and enable it to run through periods of 30 years or so, with a decoupling of demand and supply over the whole of that period. I assume that the storage, most of the storage that will be needed to back up the whole UK energy system would be hydrogen at this time scale. Hydrogen storage exhibits significant economies of scales, which are illustrated in a simplified and stylized way in this graph. Now, if cost minimization were the sole criterion for making the decision about how to deploy this storage, the result would be a small number of centrally located hydrogen stores, either salt caverns or disused natural gas fields sitting upstream of a high-pressure hydrogen transmission system. One of the things that we showed, however, in our paper was that distributed energy storage deployed at multiple levels in the energy system can result in significantly higher resilience. A second possible location for hydrogen storage within the energy system would be at the location of electricity substations of the order of 400,000 electricity substations in the United Kingdom. And the cost of deploying at 400,000 substations, although significantly higher than the 10 to 100 centrally located caverns of gas fields, will provide backup at the level of the electricity distribution system, allow islanding and provide local black start capability, and back up essential subsystems such as communications, banking, transport, and traffic management. And as we've seen from some significant outages that have occurred over the last 10 years in the United Kingdom, these last few systems, communications, banking, transport, and traffic management, turn out to be absolutely critical in determining the speed of recovery of a system from a significant outage. A third option for deploying hydrogen storage will be at the level of individual buildings. But given that there are roughly 30 million buildings in the United Kingdom, this would result in significantly higher overall costs. This figure now shows in a highly simplified form the three separate alternative architectures strung out along a Pareto front. Where should the balance be struck? There is insufficient information in this figure to decide, but by setting costs out in this way, we may illuminate the nature of the underlying strategic choice and expedite and support the decision-making process. One of the issues we address in our paper is the importance of using energy system architecture to manage complexity. This particular passage, which we've taken from Crawley, Cameron, and Selber's book, System Architecture, eloquently illustrates the principle. In our paper, we discuss the way storage provides partial compartmentation of an otherwise increasingly complex energy system with respect to operability. In a dynamic and interconnected system with significant capability for intertemporal shifting of energy, the operator of each subsystem needs to maintain models of the current and likely future states of adjacent subsystems. Stores between subsystems allow these models to be simpler and to operate at lower temporal resolution. The juxtaposition of energy with conventional engineering systems, however, must focus our attention on the fact that in energy systems, there is no single architect, there is no single controlling mind. does it make sense to apply concepts developed primarily in the aerospace sector to energy? Let us compare and contrast. In the next few minutes, I will compare the UK energy system with the Apollo program, an archetypal aerospace engineering system, against these 6 criteria: cost, lifetime, endowment, decision-making structure, objectives, and consequences of failure. To begin with costs, it turns out that costs for Apollo and the decarbonisation of the UK energy system are comparable. Both of the order of £1 to £2 trillion at current prices. But beyond that, things begin to diverge. The lifetime for the Apollo system was about 10 years, and this is far shorter than the 100+ years of the UK and US energy systems. With respect to endowment, the designers of Apollo started with a clean slate. There was nothing. Everything could be put in place, all the different components could be put in place de novo. This compares with the situation in the UK and US energy systems, where each generation of engineers coming into those systems face a complex, sedimented, and often poorly documented endowment with individual pieces of infrastructure which may be 50 or 60 years old. And in the United Kingdom over the last couple of years, we've decommissioned coal-fired power stations, which were up to 60 years old. With respect to decision-making structure, in the Apollo program, we saw a centralized top-down decision-making structure, quasi-military in form. And this is radically different from the diverse, complex, polycentric structure that we see in the UK energy system. Indeed, there is a Department of State, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which is charged with overseeing and organising the UK energy sector, but its task is made significantly more difficult than perhaps it might be by the unfashionability of centralized top-down decision-making, top-down political decision-making in the world of 2020. With respect to objectives, the objectives of the Apollo program were really quite simple: to take a man, or perhaps 2 men, to the surface of the moon and bring them home again within a period not much longer than a single presidential term. Those objectives essentially stayed constant throughout the Apollo program. This contrasts with the situation that we see in energy, where, for example, the carbon target that is driving much of energy policy has driven much of energy policy over the last 20 years, has evolved considerably. 3 separate occasions, starting with 60% reduction, ambition then increasing to 80% reduction, and then finally, at the end of 2019, moving to complete decarbonisation, including non-energy systems, net zero carbon. Critically, each of those changes significantly changes the mix of technologies which are involved, which are required to achieve the objective. Finally, the consequences of failure, as we said in our paper, Apollo, while expensive, was only ever incidental to the survival of the US economy. It's possible in amongst certain groups of people within MIT that may hurt, but I think it's true. Whereas a fully functioning energy system is absolutely critical to the continued existence of the UK and the US as advanced industrialized societies. And with the electrification of almost everything, that system has to run absolutely continuously. As I've said already, one of the main differences between energy systems and aerospace systems is the absence of a central architect, the absence of a controlling mind in the context of energy system decision making. What we have is multiple stakeholders, and a thoroughly decentralized decision-making process. And yet we contend that the architectural perspective complements, frames, and organizes the interpretation of results of bottom-up energy system modeling, and that the tools and concepts of system architecture appear to be of great value for informing and structuring debate and supporting collective decision-making. This last contention is something that we intend to demonstrate with stakeholders over the next 2 to 3 years. That, Chair, brings me to the end of my presentation. It only remains for me to thank my co-authors once again, and to acknowledge the rest of the consortium, and finally to thank my audience for your attention. Thank you.
Professor Lowe, you mentioned you had an alternative ending. I don't know if you can address that before we go into the question period.
Yeah, it's very short. But what I wanted to do was to try to distill some additional overarching messages from the paper. The first thing I want to point out is that the structure of energy system models tends always to lag behind the problems and solutions that emerge in the real world. No energy system model that I'm aware of could have predicted the cascade of failure that took place in the United Kingdom in August 2019. Or could have provided much insight into the multiple interlocking mechanisms that turned out to be at work in it. The second thing is that it's likely to be technically impossible to identify all failure modes in complex systems. This is something that the aerospace industry is keenly aware of. But it's something that I think clearly applies to the energy system of places like the United Kingdom, the US, and I'm sure other countries as well. Part of the problem is that innovation has the capacity to build in new latent failure modes into complex systems. Such failure modes do not become visible except under extraordinary conditions, such as during a major failure of energy supply systems. In general, innovation has the potential to change everything, not just the thing that's the object or the product of the innovation. And we refer in the paper to a number of, to three references in particular, by Perrow, by Cook, and by Kemp. The future trajectory of the energy system will therefore emerge from the interaction of a series of planned interventions.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lauren Heller, Vice Chancellor for Finance and Administration here at UW-Madison.
That might be my
This is
fault.
the first of two employees.
I apologize. That was because I had not stopped the YouTube. Please carry on.
That's okay. It was my fault for not being able to get the thing going in the first place properly. The future trajectory of the energy system will therefore emerge from the interaction of a series of planned interventions by energy supply organizations, for example, together with learning by doing. The resulting trajectories will inevitably be indeterminate and path dependent. A further source of indeterminacy is the polycentric nature of decision-making, which I've referred to already. The UK, and I'm sure the US energy system, is characterized by multiple stakeholders with non-overlapping sets of interests, in some cases incompatible sets of interests and objectives. actions by each stakeholder interact in a non-linear way with those of other stakeholders in a process which, like the weather, becomes progressively harder to predict the further one attempts to look into the future. I've already asserted the importance of developing an energy system architecture perspective. The system architecture discipline that's emerged from the aerospace sector holds that system architecture begins with an analysis of stakeholder requirements. One of the problems that we have is that stakeholder requirements, as we've seen, tend to evolve, and the fact that stakeholder requirements themselves include tacitly, if not explicitly, the interest of stakeholders themselves. So I think that is probably enough from me. Chair, over to you and the rest of the panelists.
Wonderful. Okay, so how I'm going to do this, we're going to open up for another 10 minutes, go to the next speaker, and then we should have a few minutes at the end to open for broad questions. We already have one or two, so if you have questions for other speakers or for the full panel, please do feel free to add them, and your name and position is welcome so I can introduce you as you ask your questions as well. So what I'm going to start with is, honestly, it piqued my curiosity. So you developed this whole framework of, or lens of viewing the system in terms of architecture and system architecture. And then you mentioned that your next steps are actually going to be taking this to a level of engagement with stakeholders to determine if there is a way to ameliorate our decision-making using this lens. I was interested if you could explain a little bit more. I mean, clearly, even the bottom-up component, you know, you can already see that how that applies to challenges with national scale decision-making in other areas. In your test model, how do you plan, at what scale do you plan to implement this? Are you viewing this like as a UK scale experiment, or are you going to bring it regional? Because clearly with polycentrism, we know we can cascade across different scales of interaction.
At the moment, just at the UK level, but you're absolutely right, Sarah, to point out that a country like the United Kingdom, or even a country like the United States, is continually having to adjust to events and developments outside. An obvious potential disruptor over the coming decades is going to be, I'm quite sure, the development, dramatic expansion of photovoltaic generation at low latitudes. One of the peculiarities of the last 20 years has been that Germany led the development of photovoltaic for about 10 years. Germany is at latitude 50. It's nearly as far north as Britain, which is at latitude 52 to 56. A bizarre place to begin the development of photovoltaic, yet that is where the development took place for many years. But that, I think, is going to be turned upside down because the tropics are simply the right place to develop and install photovoltaics. That will inevitably impact on what goes on here in the United Kingdom, in the rest of Europe, and I'm quite sure within North America.
Wonderful, thanks. We have a question coming in from Buzz, who's one of the panelists. He says, where do you think the biggest needs for innovation are? Where do you think they are? And also, do you think we will need to see some tropical energy superpowers?
I think we will see some tropical or subtropical energy superpowers. Perhaps not in the next 5 years, but I think between 2030 and 2040, we will see these tropical, subtropical energy superpowers beginning to come online, and the impact of that will be felt through long-distance electricity transmission systems, which have been the subject of various talks today, but also through the development of hydrogen and hydrogen-derived fuels, which will enable us to begin to decarbonize long-distance shipping, aviation, heavy industry, and so on.
And so I'm going to sneak in one other question. I don't see any more for now, and then we will pass along to Rachel. We'll open up. I'll start introducing her. But I have a question more related to, you went through some of the costs of storage. This is a little bit related to Buzz's question in terms of innovation that needs to happen, but you went through a few different forms of storage. So my question is, well, so what do you think, you know, in your perspective, particularly for the UK, are kind of the lowest hanging fruit that would be, you know, the most important for a more sustainable and lower carbon energy transition on the one hand, but then on the other hand, you know, and I have my own personal opinions about this, but we want to hear yours. But, you know, there's a lot of pushback and questions about, you know, hydrogen as storage and pluses and minuses. For example, in terms of the two types that you mentioned, what are the key pluses and minuses that you might think might be major inhibitors or supporters in terms of, you know, actually enabling such a transition?
That's a very good question. And the most important enabler of hydrogen is the fact that the United Kingdom has a gas grid which supplies about 80% of the population. At the moment, that transmits methane, natural gas, but there is a lot of interest and a lot of work going on to develop, to convert that gas grid to hydrogen. It's not simple, and there are disadvantages to, for example, making use of gas to provide heat in buildings. The most important one of which is that if you use renewable electricity to generate your hydrogen, you need about 4 times as much renewable electricity if you are supplying heat using hydrogen, compared with the situation where you supply electricity to individual buildings and then make use of heat pumps to do the final stage of conversion. So there are potentially, the hydrogen solution is not the cheapest. And there's this fascinating tension within the United Kingdom, and you'll see that I'm deliberately not giving my own opinion here, but there's a fascinating tension within the United Kingdom between interests, in particular the gas industry, which wants to see a rosy future for the gas industry, and I touched on that in my closing comments, and other stakeholders who would perhaps place more weight on overall cost of the transition rather than ease of the transition and the fit between choice of technology and existing infrastructure.
Yeah, that's right. These are major challenges for many of our infrastructure questions, including, you know, questions about future vehicles. So thanks again very much for your insights. I do hope you're staying for the end because we already have one question for the full panel. Wonderful, thank you very much. And we're now going to, and for everyone who's on